Professor, could you say a bit more about this psychogeography you mentioned earlier?
Well, I could give you a short history of the subject, though it's not a subject in the academic sense, as far as I'm aware, or at least not at the college where I teach.
But what is it exactly? It sounds rather complicated. A mixture of what? Psychology and geography?
No, not at all. Well, the first theorist of it was a Frenchman, Guy Debord, and basically, in his words, it's the study of the effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviour of people. Put like that, of course, it doesn't sound like anything new. People have always been aware at some level of the effect of their surroundings on their emotions and way of life. And this includes not just buildings, but the landscape as a whole, the climate, and so on. But it is mainly an urban thing. And these days, people who call themselves psychogeographers tend to be harsh critics of the way modern city planners develop urban space. Really, I suppose, it asks people to pay more attention to their environment, be critical of it, and to note not just the aspects we've already mentioned, but the atmosphere created by them as well. I could go on and tell you how to go about it, but all you have to do is go online and you'll find a site for almost any city you care to name. It's worth looking into.
As you have probably noticed, fashions and tastes change quite noticeably over the years, most obviously perhaps in clothes, hairstyles and popular music. The reputations of writers and artists are no different, though the alternating periods of being in and then out of fashion are longer. A poet may no longer appeal to a large reading public for a number of reasons, though we must keep in mind that poetry is a minority taste, and its readership is relatively small in the first place. So, I want to look at the reputation of Alexander Pope. In his own lifetime, he was praised and idolized by both his friends and the literary world in general, though he did have some rather vicious enemies. Yet both friends and enemies seemed more concerned with either praising or attacking his character and morals than with properly assessing the poems themselves. The Romantics, of course, had little time for him. Indeed, the Romantic movement, in poetry at least, was an attempt to make a complete break with the strict formality and rationality of the Augustan poets, of whom Pope was the most notable example. They did not regard him as a real poet, and complained of his ignorance of nature in the sense of mountains, trees and flowers. The Victorians were even less responsive to Pope, and this was probably the period when his reputation was at its lowest. In fact, it wasn't until the 1920s that Pope and the Augustan poets were re-evaluated, and given the attention and respect they deserved.
Perhaps the first example of what could be called a newspaper was the Acta Diurna, roughly daily news, that Julius Caesar introduced in 59 BC. This was a handwritten news sheet posted daily in the Forum at Rome and in other common meeting places around the city. Of course, a lot of the news would be out of date in the sense that, for example, it took a long time for reports of a victory in a distant country to get back to Rome. Nonetheless, a lot of the items included are similar to those found in more modern newspapers. News of battles, as already mentioned, as well as political and military appointments, political events, and even a social diary recording marriages, births and deaths. One mustn't forget sport, if that is what you call it. Just like modern fans of football, sports-minded Romans could keep up with the latest results of the gladiator contests. People who lived in the provinces and wanted to be kept up to date would send scribes to Rome to copy the news and have them send it back by letter. Many of these scribes could make extra money by providing the news to more than one client. Quite a few of them were slaves and would go on to use the extra money earned to buy their freedom.
Did anyone happen to catch the American Metropolis last night? It was about the growth of cities.
I didn't see that, but I did see part of a documentary last week that told about a guy, I think he was a visitor from another country, who wrote a book about the growth of industry and so on, the things we've just studied. I remember he said there was a huge population explosion that turned America into a nation of cities all within a decade. He was talking mostly about Baltimore.
Baltimore then or now?
In the 19th century, right after the Civil War.
The program you saw was part of the same series as the one I want to tell you about. Last night the topic was New York City. As early as 1880, the federal government wrote a report on how the 5 separate municipalities of New York actually constituted one vast metropolitan area. It was a progressive way of thinking at the time, and within 20 years, those 5 municipalities were officially united as a single city by a vote of the people. To this day, however, each borough maintains traces of its original independence.
I agree with that. I'm from Brooklyn, and it's definitely different from the rest of New York.
Because of their protected status, a lot of bears have lost their fear of people. This may make them appear tame, but they're still potentially very dangerous. Bears are wild animals. 1 or 2 bear attacks occur each year in Glacier Park. The majority of attacks occur because people have surprised the bear.
What should we do if we surprise a bear?
You should try to avoid encounters in the first place by being alert and make noise, talk loud, holler. Bears will usually move out of the way if they hear people approaching.
Some people say to carry bells or put bells on your pack.
Most bells, even the so-called bear bells, are not loud enough. Calling out or clapping hands at regular intervals are better ways to make your presence known.
But isn't it kind of rude to make a lot of noise in the woods? I mean, people go there for peace and quiet.
In bear country, noise is good for you. Hiking quietly endangers you, the bear, and other hikers. People sometimes assume they don't have to make noise while hiking on a well-used trail. Some of the most frequently used trails in Glacier Park are surrounded by excellent bear habitat. You can't predict when and where bears might appear along a trail.
That's for sure. I remember my surprise when a black bear charged me. It must have been running away from hikers who surprised it on the trail ahead of me.
Don't assume a bear's hearing is any better than your own. Some trail conditions make it hard for bears to see, hear, or smell approaching hikers. You should be especially careful near streams, against the wind, or in dense vegetation. Stay with your group and, if possible, avoid hiking early in the morning, late in the day, or after dark, when bears are more likely to be active. Bears spend a lot of time eating, so avoid hiking in areas like berry patches or fields of glacier lilies.
How will the bear act if we surprise it?
Bears react differently to each situation. They may appear to tolerate you and then attack without warning. The most important advice I can give you is never to approach a bear intentionally.
No matter whether we live in the country, the suburbs, or the city, we come in contact with forests every day. A combination of trees, other plants, insects, wildlife, soil, water, air, and people is a forest. I'm a professional forester. That means I've been trained in the management of forests. Managing a forest is both a science and an art, which is why my education included courses in the biological, physical, and social sciences, as well as the humanities.
Doesn't being a forester mean you always work in the woods?
Foresters, of course, do work in the woods. More and more, however, they also work in laboratories, classrooms, planning agencies, corporate offices, and so forth. In fact, our professional organization, the Society of American Foresters, lists over 700 job categories.
I've always been confused about the difference between a national park and a national forest. In a lot of ways, they're similar. For example, we can camp and hike in both.
There is a difference between them. National parks, such as Yellowstone, are set aside and preserved in a near-natural state, mainly for the recreational enjoyment of the public. Our parks are administered by the Department of the Interior. National forests, on the other hand, are administered by the Department of Agriculture. Our forests are managed for their many benefits, including recreation, wood products, wildlife, and water.
That means there's a difference between a forester and a park ranger, right?
Yes, there are differences. A forester manages an area of forest for forest products, water quality, wildlife, recreation, and so on. A park ranger, on the other hand, manages an area in a national or state park, mainly for recreation. Another difference is who owns the land. A forester can work on federal, state, or private land, while a park ranger is almost always a government employee.
My major is biology, but I'd like to work in the woods, in the area of wildlife preservation. Would that make me a forester or a biologist?
Some foresters are primarily biologists, but most foresters majored in forestry management. Foresters and wildlife biologists often work together as a team. Both foresters and biologists want to see that various types of habitat flourish. Deer, for example, require a different habitat than wolves, yet the forest can accommodate them both.
I'm absolutely delighted first of all to have been appointed to this professorship. The role is going to be about public engagement in science. It is about making science accessible to as wide an audience as possible. It's about encouraging young people to think about science as a career. It's about making it easier for our academics here at the University of Birmingham to talk about their research to the general public, and it's not just about a one-way flow of information. It very much is about a dialogue.
To begin with, you should be standing in the main floor of the British Library. British Library is situated on the Euston Road next to some pipe crustacean press, in the foyer to the left of the information desk. It was a large white staircase. Follow this up towards the gallery at the top of the stairs. Pause and look to your left for attention. This is Robert Cotton, born in 1570 and died in 1631. Cotton was a member of Parliament, but he is mainly known as a great antiquarian collector of manuscripts. It is the covenant we have a great depth and the survival of many English manuscripts. Throughout this tour, we will see his legacy,
Social harm originates out of a series of debates within criminology about the narrowness of the definition of crime that essentially focuses on individual acts of harm, things like interpersonal violence, theft, so on and so forth. So the idea of social harm originally was to expand that notion of harm to encompass the harms that organizations cause, that nation-states cause. But latterly the idea of social harm really now transcends criminology, so there are a group of writers who think that, and I would include myself there, that actually there's something to social harm that could be very useful in terms of trying to understand the harms that occur within society, to produce an objective and well-rounded analysis of harm.
Well, 3D printing started in the 1980s. At that time it used to be referred to as rapid prototyping, where companies were able to use it, for instance, to visualize the shape of the component or a component they're about to make. But then during the last 10 years the technology has evolved from the prototyping level to the manufacturing level, specifically when it started to move from plastics to metallic materials. My interest specifically is in the field of high-value additive manufacturing, meaning that we use additive manufacturing to produce components for aeroplanes or for cars.
Perhaps you've seen pictures of the large array of, those radio telescopes in New Mexico, scanning the skies for intelligent life in the movie Contact. Well, radiant astronomers have cause to celebrate the first phase of a giant new radio telescope array went operational in Northern California. It's going to help astronomers study things like black holes and dark galaxies, all the while scanning the stars for, who knows, radio signals coming from somewhere else in the universe. Maybe ET is phoning home. For the first time, Japanese researchers have conducted a real-life experiment that shows how some traffic jams appear for no apparent reason. They placed 22 vehicles on a single track and asked the drivers to cruise around at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour. At first, traffic moved smoothly, but soon, the distance between cars started to vary, and vehicles clumped together at one point on the track, but the jam spread backward around the track, like a shockwave at a rate of about 20 kilometers an hour. Real-life jams move backward at about the same speed.
Each kind of insurance protects its policyholder against possible financial loss. Life insurance pays your family a certain sum upon your death. The purpose of life insurance is to provide your family with financial security, an immediate estate that will allow them to maintain the household after you die. Health insurance protects you against large medical expenses. When you pay premiums to your insurance company, you can ensure payment of your medical bills. Another kind, property liability insurance, is sometimes called casualty insurance because it covers the cost of accidents, like automobile accidents, fire, and theft. If you're like most people, your home is the largest single investment you make in your life. This is why most homeowners have some type of property liability insurance.
Our knowledge of the oceans 100 years ago was confined to the two-dimensional shape of the sea surface and the hazards of navigation presented by the irregularities in depth of the shallow water close to the land. The open sea was deep and mysterious, and anyone who gave more than a passing thought to the bottom confines of the oceans probably assumed that the seabed was flat. Sir James Clark Ross had obtained a sounding of over 2,400 fathoms in 1839, but it was not until 1869, when HMS Porcupine was put at the disposal of the Royal Society for several cruises, that a series of deep soundings was obtained in the Atlantic, and the first samples were collected by dredging the bottom. Shortly after this, the famous HMS Challenger expedition established the study of the seafloor as a subject worthy of the most qualified physicists and geologists. A burst of activity associated with the laying of submarine cables soon confirmed the Challenger's observation that many parts of the ocean were 2 to 3 miles deep, and the existence of underwater features of considerable In the early days of the settlement of Australia, enterprising settlers unwisely introduced the European rabbit. This rabbit had no natural enemies in the Antipodes, so that it multiplied with that promiscuous, abandoned characteristic of rabbits. It overran a whole continent. It caused devastation by burrowing and by devouring the herbage which might have maintained millions of sheep and cattle. Scientists discovered that this particular variety of rabbit, and apparently no other animal, was susceptible to a fatal virus disease, myxomatosis. By infecting animals and letting them loose in the burrows, local epidemics of this disease could be created. Later it was found that there was a type of mosquito which acted as the carrier of this disease and passed it on to the rabbits. So while the rest of the world was trying to get rid of mosquitoes, Australia was encouraging this one. It effectively spread the disease all over the continent and drastically reduced the rabbit population. It later became apparent that rabbits were developing a degree of resistance to this disease, so that the rabbit population was unlikely to be completely exterminated. There were hopes, however, that the problem of the rabbit would become
When you hear things like human DNA differs from chimp DNA by only a couple %, you can't help but wonder, how can that be? How can so few changes make such a big difference? Researchers working with fruit bats and mice think they have an answer, and it lies less in the animal's genes than in the short snippets of DNA that control when and where and how vigorously genes are turned on. If you've ever thought that a bat is basically just a rodent with wings, you're not too far from the mark. One of the most obvious differences between bats and mice is their forearms. Mice have these stubby little legs, and bats have these large, leathery wings. But even those differences are not as major as you might imagine. Mice and bats both have a gene called PRX1, which regulates limb development, but the gene is more active in the budding wings of bats. So the researchers took the piece of DNA that controls PRX1 activity from a bat and stuck it into a mouse. The result, pictured in the January 15 issue of Genes in Development, mice that have longer front legs. Okay, they didn't sprout wings, but the study shows that even small changes can have big consequences. Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Karen Hopkin.
This is Scientific American's 60-Second Science. I'm Wade Gibbs. Got a minute? If you want to see evolution at work, visit a hospital. Inside a sick patient, antibiotics wipe out infectious bacteria by the millions, but germs are always mutating. A few adapt to resist the drug, so they survive and spread. Such antibiotic-resistant bacteria infect 2 million Americans every year. They kill 23,000. In this arms race between medicine and evolution, evolution is winning. But could we turn evolution against bacteria? It turns out that when bacteria mutate to become resistant to one antibiotic, they often become more vulnerable to a different drug. So maybe after a jab with the left, a roundhouse to the right will deliver a knockout blow.
Down goes Fraser!
To test this idea, researchers in Denmark dosed batches of E. coli with 23 different antibiotics and waited for resistance to evolve. In 3/4 of the cases, the mutant germs became more susceptible to a second drug. The work appears in the journal Science Translational Medicine. One particular combination of widely used antibiotics, gentamicin, then cefuroxime, then gentamicin again, and so on, Looks like it could hold the bugs at bay indefinitely.
Resistance is futile.
Thanks for the minute. For Scientific American's 60-Second Science, I'm Wade Gibbs.
Politicians need to be more proactive when addressing a given issue. Remember to sign the attendance prior to the class.
Communication skills are increasingly important in recent years.
Time was needed to process complex lectures. A national collection center is currently being built.
The balance in diet and exercise makes good health.
You must sign for attendance of this class.